Attempt a gazillion. I give anyone who has a video channel 11 out of 10 for doing this. It is flipping hard work. Now, for those of you that were a little bit more diligent and didn't use my potential virus and contaminant as an excuse not to even talk to me within 200 yards and hid behind cars, it was raised that you understand that we've got to look back at fiscal, monetary, and supply side policy after banking and stuff. Jesus, that's boring. But one weak area was 4.1.8.8, which, as you all know, is mergers, acquisitions, regulation, deregulation, public ownership and privatisation. Now, according to the Examiner, you, in a decent bit of depth, need to understand the reasons for and against public ownership, privatisation, basically all the things I mentioned, regulation of markets and deregulation. Also the notion of regulatory capture, and you need to have examples. Now, I'll talk about that in particular reference in a moment. The basics, which I assume you all know, is that the CMA is the body that is the government's body whereby they do look at the industry. So if any firm's generating more than £70 million a year in revenue, or has 25% or more control of a market, then they will investigate to make sure that any merger acquisition is in the interest of the consumer and doesn't significantly, is the case there, significantly lessen the competition in that local, regional or national market. So the main aim of the CMA is to ensure that the market doesn't worsen for consumers, whether that is choice or quality, the different non-price competitive things. Obviously price competition, but there are other things that you can bring into that. Now, they also, as well as stopping mergers, they obviously can allow mergers to go through, either because they're going to have no significant impact on the market, or if they think they might have a significant impact on the market, they will make them abide by certain rules and so forth. Now, down to you whether you think that the present light touch that our free market orientated government and CMA has is in the interest of the consumer or doesn't work far enough. For example, several years ago, decade or so ago, I guess now, was when Cadbury's was bought out, and that was allowed to happen because it was deemed not to significantly, it was an international deal as well, but it was deemed to be fine. But they also promised Cadbury's and the government that jobs would be maintained and everything was fine. 18 months, 2 years down the line, once the government had been pacified, then Cadbury's, with their new parent company, quite quickly shut down factories and moved them to Eastern Europe. So it's quite toothless, really, regulation in the UK a lot of the time. You've heard me go on about the water industry down in Devon, whereby water companies get fined tens of thousands of pounds for polluting riverways, the ocean and stuff like that. And it's just cheaper for them to do it that way. Take a £10,000 hit every 6 to 12 months for polluting a waterway, rather than paying out 2.5 million to increase or improve an infrastructure somewhere or put proper UV filters in. It's such light touch that regulatory authorities don't have the power to penalise companies enough to make it financially worth their while to do the right thing. So as I said, you guys need to have examples. The most relevant example, too, I can think of are Sainsbury's and Asda. That was 2018. Be very much aware of that. Be aware of the reasons why. And it primarily was it would have a significant impact on competition, especially on a local level. There were locations where Sainsbury's and Asda's were literally across the road from each other. Sainsbury's and Asda said that this merger would just be about cost saving, which would pass on to consumer, and there wouldn't be any reduction in choice and that sort of stuff. But quite clearly, if you've got a store or two stores opposite each other, you've got diseconomies of scale within that situation. And just like with the Cadbury's idea, once 18 months, 2 years down the line, it was quite clear that Sainsbury's and Asda, under their new management system, would start to try and benefit from economies of scale. spin off one of the stores? Why have two managers? Why have two everything? When you can maybe have, maybe one larger store, which would maintain the choice possibly, but you wouldn't have the choice of Sainsbury's or Asda, so reduce choice. So reduce it to one store, benefit from economies of scale, and you'd save money. That would be a significant impact on competition, quite clearly. Another one, sorry, I got an itchy nose. Another one would be Pepsi and Walkers. Sorry, slip of the tongue there. Pepsi and Pipers. Now, that was cleared. So the acquisition was allowed to go ahead after an investigation. Now, I haven't looked into that, but after an investigation, I guess there was a lot of noise from Pepsi saying it'll be fine. Pepsi owned Walkers. So essentially, it wasn't a Pepsi Piper's Crisps acquisition, it was a Walker's Piper's acquisition. But because Pepsi, I guess, were the parent company, Piper's being a niche market rather than mass market, it was deemed to be not something that would change the market or the nature of competition significantly. So it was allowed to go ahead. There's other examples. South SSE and North Npower, they tried to merge. It was allowed to happen after a consultation. Again, you'd have to look into that, but the consultation, I assume, was with the industry themselves. So the industry themselves would say, well, create lower costs, which I can pass on to consumers, which two firms merging would then lead to market powers where we can set lower prices for consumers, and then everybody else has to follow. I don't know what was said, but quite clearly the market was able to manipulate the authority. So anyway, I'll leave that with you. But in that area, something that was clearly said was, from the examiner, that students often answered competition policy poorly because of a lack of context. And I keep talking to you about context. And if you've got context, then you can apply it, and then that gets you up through the mark boundaries. And that context, even better, if you've got any numbers, then the examiner gets very excited with numbers. But it's not necessarily to have the numbers, but the context and the understanding of, these three factors. What was the notion of the intervention, i.e. why was the CMA looking at this? Who were the companies involved? And what was the outcome? Was it going to be to the betterment of the consumer, or was it going to be for the worst for the consumer? The Competition and Mergers Authority, or whoever, was it the Ofcom? Just be aware the different regulatory authorities. Ofcom is obviously communication, Ofwat is for water, but you've got natural monopolies there. Ofgen, which is the guys that would have been looking at SSE and Npower. Be aware of who it is. Don't try just to go for the regulatory authority. Be aware of who it is. And if you do that, then you will shoot up through the ranks in regards to marking scheme, because the examiner is happy that your contextual knowledge is backing up your textbook knowledge. And don't forget, if you've got good contextual knowledge, you don't need to go through the rigmarole of giving basic definitions and stuff like that. Belts and braces, if you want to do the basic definitions, in case you're concerned that in your contextual understanding and the further stuff, your explanations and your diagrams doesn't show that basic knowledge, then do belts and braces. But if you are empowered and have the strength that you have the good knowledge throughout your answers, then you don't have to bother with that, so you could save a little bit of time. So come up with your own examples. One that I'm looking at here is the fact that you've got price setting within the funeral industry. It is a weird industry. You don't go in and say, I'd like a discount. But there is an issue within that market. So I might actually set homework, just out of morbid curiosity, to see what you find out about that. What can they do to intervene to control monopolies? That's essentially what they're looking at. Monopolies reduce choice and significantly impact the nature of competition with the market. So you could whack a tax. This is what we're going to do. You whack a tax on a monopoly. So the government realises that there's a monopoly in the situation, let's whack a tax on their profits. Now, that could be in the form of what they call windfall tax on these supernormal profits. And what that does is that money can be used elsewhere to maybe subsidise an industry. So you give a windfall tax on the Ofgen, give a windfall tax on the gas and electric market. That money is then used to subsidise or somehow give access to cheaper energy for lower income people. Now the problem with that is, so this is a negative, that could lead to tax avoidance. So these big firms, they go offshore, so they're not registered in the UK, and so you get no tax, not just a lack of a windfall tax. And then the other thing is, obviously, because you're taxing them, this one-off tax, they would argue that they can't spend that money on R&D, so they lose the ability to do capital expenditure. And they would argue again that capital expenditure in the use of R&D would be used on either green fuels, better for the environment, better for society, reduction in negative externalities, or to reduce the cost to the consumer. So they would argue economically, don't tax us, don't penalise us, because we have to pass that on at some level to the consumers. Don't forget that we're talking about regulation here, but deregulation, liberalisation of a market is a policy. You could argue that's do nothing, but liberalisation of the market is a policy, as is deliberalisation. But anyway, so you could break up monopolies, allow smaller businesses, so it becomes more contestable. Don't forget about that terminology, a more contestable market. The problem there is you end up with lots of little firms who, with no benefit of economies of scale, highly inefficient because they're so small, and they struggle to scale up manufacturing or whatever it is, and consumers are penalised again because they're paying high prices. So these big companies that monopolise a market are significantly important. Introduce price capping policies. Now that depends on whether you price cap at market price, above market price, or below market prices. You should end up with an increase in consumer surplus. Look at your basic supply and demand diagram for that one, that's useful. But they could find prices from other ways. Or rather, they can increase prices in other ways. So your price of energy is at a certain price, but what about your standing charge? Basically, standing charge is your rent for having gas connected to your house. So you pay a maximum price for the units provided, but that goes up in price. So you end up levelling out again. There's no benefit to anybody. And then my favourite, I think, increasingly, especially at the moment, in regards to government intervention, in regards to how do you deal with a failing market potentially, where you've got significant competition failings or those sorts of things, is nationalisation. You basically take them back as a government. Take utilities back, take the NHS completely back. I'll finish up in a moment, but we're currently renting beds from the private sector at, what is it, 2.5 million a day, something like that. You check your numbers yourself. There's a huge opportunity cost. That money could be used to ensure that our frontline NHS staff, doctors, nurses, have hazmat kit, so that when they're treating these patients at the moment during the current pandemic, they have the kit they need to ensure their safety, and then the safety of those around them. But we're giving that money away to the private sector just to have access to their beds. Could follow the French model, take it back. Completely nationalise it. If you want to be nice, you pay a price, I guess. Or take it back at a nominal price or zero cost. But then you'd argue that you lose productive efficiency, because don't forget, the market is better at being productively efficient. They know the industry, they know what they're doing. Apparently the NHS doesn't, with its 100 years of history and its ability to be one of the best medical care providers on the planet, with all the monopsony buying power, monopsony control, they don't know the market. But there is that counter argument that it would lose productivity. And I'm going to finish at this point because otherwise it'll be longer than I expected. Industry regulators are rule enforcers. They regulate as if they're a surrogate for the company. They're there to, they behave or we'll tell you off. That's essentially what they do. They're appointed by government to see how markets and the outcomes of efficiency and welfare are operating. Quite clearly, we've got a welfare gap, a loss of welfare at the moment, because firms are still profit orientated. The main one we've got in the UK, is the Competition and Markets Authority, but please be aware that you do have Ofcom, Ofgem. You've even got the dreaded Ofsted. I'm hoping under today's present circumstances, Ofsted aren't sort of circling around looking for failing schools as, half the sort of yesterday, 16% of staff like me were out. And they're responsible for CMA, not Ofsted, are responsible for investigating mergers, markets that are failing, regulated industries, and enforcing competition and consumer law, making sure that we're all being treated fairly. So, there's a variety of them, and the top graders amongst you will be aware what the difference is. And so, just to remind you, Ofwat, water companies, CMA, Competition and Mergers Authority, Telecom and Broadcasting Authority, Ofcom, the FCA, Financial Services. Then you've got the Office of Rail Regulatory Services or something. Doesn't slip off the tongue as well. Which are the rail regulators, which again, God knows what they're doing. And then you've got Ofgem, the generation people, Ofsted as well. And so just be aware of all those things. So what I expect you to do in my absence is, and I will add some more of these videos if you find them useful, and I'll do a diagram one in a bit, is to, in my absence, find your own example. If you want to pick on the Asda Sainsbury's one, look at it in detail. If you want to pick on the Pepsi, don't forget the Young Walkers, which is an interesting one. Pepsi Walkers Piper's Crisp one, that's a good one. Make sure you look at that in detail, so you've got evidence to talk about it rather than this fluffy sort of approach about, well, the competition authority need to ensure that people have choice, and it's very lame if you've got no bite to it, no context. So if you find this useful, I'll do a couple more of them. If you find it entertaining, maybe I'll do a couple more of them, but it is challenging. In my absence, I quite like the idea of you doing it, because it makes you worry, or whatever. But I'll look back at this, and just so you know, probably I'll look at the diagram and how you break it down. And again, I mentioned that, but several of you are just using the diagram, not using it. You're just dropping it in and not explaining it. Candidates are not going to impress the examiner if you just plonk it in, but I'll talk about that later. But anyway, take care of yourself, and this is today's lesson so far. Okay, cheers.